That says the 21st of January, 1943. I had I was 19.
You just turned 19?
And see, I'm born November 23, so I just turned 19. And then went on to the 20 and had my 21st birthday in Southern Holland somewhere. And there was no cake or any celebration. I liked the military drill. I wasn't that adept at the obstacle course. I liked the rifle practice and rifle drill. I found that all challenging. Route marches were a piece of cake for me because we walked in the country, and I enjoyed the discipline, but it's looking back on it, it was a good time of my life. I learned a lot and learned to take orders and cooperate with others. It was good. And that was in Ottawa, Lansdowne Park. And then they moved us back to Kingston, and we took advanced training there. And then we had to qualify as a trade of some kind in the ordnance. I had signed up to be a driver mechanic, and that was going to be further classroom work and training on cars, because I was not a qualified mechanic. I'd worked on cars. I didn't think I was going to get overseas, so I decided to take a dispatch rider course, which is the shortest course available. And I survived that, and that was the training. And then after 6 months in the Army, I got a furlough, 2-week furlough to go home, which I did, and all the way from Kingston to Hampton, which was, I got home and Dad decided to shingle the barn roof, and I peeled off my shirt and helped him, and thought, well, it's getting a little warm, I better put my shirt back on. And of course I hadn't been exposed to the sun, my back in the Army, and I was cooked. 2 days later, I got a telegram report back immediately. I was on overseas draft. Hooray! Went back to the district depot is where I was, and they moved us across the road to Berryfield Camp. And we really marched time there, on and off overseas draft. Finally, they moved us to Debert, Nova Scotia in December of 43, and that was not a happy move. It was cold. We were out on parade when it was 15 below zero, and I didn't particularly, and we were just doing fatigues and route marches and assault courses, and pretty boring. And motorcycles had been stopped because a lieutenant had killed himself on an icy road. So I was a double Joe boy. And anyway, eventually we got on overseas draft and went across the big pond. We landed at Liverpool, and there was a air raid on, so that was our introduction to war. We had to stay out. The boat wouldn't go into the dock until the air raid was over. And then they loaded our equipment onto a 60 weight truck and loaded us onto a train and took us down to Aldershot. That's where we did our further training in England. And we did quite a bit of parade square. Our lieutenant discovered that several of us liked the parade square drill, and so he formed a precision squad out of us. And I forget how many movements we could go through without having any orders. He would start off by saying help, and then we went through helping arms, presenting arms, blah blah blah, and then we would do an about turn or a left turn, then straight march ahead, halt, do an about turn, and march back. And we had several maneuvers that we went through without any orders being given. So when we got to the depot there, they just lined us up on the parade square. We had our full packs on and our greatcoat because it was winter, and we just peeled our greatcoats and packs off, leave them on the ground, standing where you are, go over to the mess hall. And got over the mess hall, you could see in, it looked as though it was roast beef. And we had one cold sandwich and one little glass of milk since the night before. So we were a little hungry, and roast beef looked real good. But it turned out to be mutton. That wasn't so good. But we ate it, and we ended up getting organized there, and their billets and everything. So that was, again, a waiting period till we were posted to our units that we were going to be serving with. Further drill, which was a little stiffer and that than we'd had in Canada. And then we were posted, and I was posted to the 202 Infantry Ordnance Sub-Park at a place called Etching Hill, which is just outside Folkestone, southeastern England. And that's where I got my bike, my first bike. And that's where, it was before that, I guess it was still in, Anyway, they gave me a button which I had 1 day on in training, and a guy named Stager had a Harley, and he was supposed to take me out and see if I could ride a bike. So he was a character. He just took off. So I drove around where I wanted to drive, and so I still find my way back, and they gave me a bike anyway. So we were in Etching Hill until we were on overseas on draft to go to France. It was in at the end of July. No, it was in early July. It was just after the fall of Caen, and we, you had to waterproof all your vehicles waterproofed. We had to waterproof our bikes, but then we put them in the back of a 60 weight truck and sealed the tailgate because you didn't know whether you were going to be driving off in the water or not. And we drove from Folkestone to Southampton to board the landing craft, and that was a long drive, and we had 3 or 4 10-ton Mack diesel trucks, and they were built for Canada. Even though it was wartime, they were built for Canada, and they had an exhaust pipe that bent toward the ditch in Canada, but over there it bent toward the middle of the road. So every time we had to block intersections and then make our way back up, and you had to drive through that, and it was hot and dusty, and we had goggles, and they gave us a kind of a screen to wipe our goggles. It was supposed to stop them from steaming up, but we wiped them, and 15 minutes later you couldn't see. So we put our goggles up on our heads, and and drove. Time we got to Southampton, our eyes were just burned. And went on sick parade to see the MO, and he called us some fancy names and told us to just use cold cloth and wipe them. So we tried to sleep with eyes open. And the next morning we loaded on and took off for France. And middle of the channel, a real wild storm developed. We were pitching and pitching. And one of the other landing craft collided with ours. Put a big gaping hole in our hull. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to start my war at the bottom of the English Channel. But they, of course, everybody gathered around. The officers had to go down and check it out. And they determined that the bottom of the hole was far enough above the water line that we could limp on into France, which we did. And the landing craft used to like to go in when the tide was high, drive up as far as they could, and then wait. If there wasn't action, you could wait, and the tide would go out. We drove off on wet sand. You go into a marshalling area and do the first part of the de-waterproofing, and unloaded our bikes, and the officer told the dispatch riders to make sure our bikes were ready to go and tanked up with gas, and then to go to bed, but not to undress, because we'd be called out sometime in the middle of the night to take the convoy wherever we had to go. So we were so tired we did get a couple hours sleep, and at least I did. And then they rolled us out, and we were on our unknown road with no lights, and we had an English dispatch rider who knew the route, and he rode at the front of the convoy, and then we had to do the blocking of the intersections and everything. Two of our most experienced DRs followed their bikes. They didn't like the idea of driving in the dark at night, and so 4 of us had to do it.
About when you got over to France and you were on the road.
Yeah. And our first camp was in a place called Benny-sur-Mer, Benny on the sea.
Oh.
And I don't remember how long we were there, but we moved on to a place called, we called it Bally, but it was B-A-S-L-Y, and we could actually see the outline of Caen from there, and we could see the rocket-firing Typhoons especially, but the Spitz and the Mustangs and, forget the other one, but they're medium bombers and fighters. But the rocket-firing Typhoon pilots were real daredevils. You'd see them zoom right down, you swear they're going to hit the buildings, and then you'd see the puff of the rockets. And that's what I wanted to be. But they wouldn't have me in the Air Force. They turned me down when I tried to join when I was 18. Anyway, we were there, and but we didn't unload any of our stores vehicles. Like, we had stores, rifles, Bren guns, Sten guns, down to watches and compasses and revolvers, and that sort of stores, right up to all the vehicles, trucks, 1,500, Jeeps, 1,500, 60 hundredweights, and these Mack. We had some diesel jobs and some gas jobs, and we even Bren gun carriers and that sort of thing. We handled all of these. We were next to the front line supply, and we had them all there in this big field, and the stores hadn't opened, and we were waiting for orders, you know, and then we got orders to move. And we found out later that the reason we hadn't been allowed to unload storage vehicles at all was that we had to be ready to retreat in 24 hours notice. So that was the beginning of the battle to get Falaise, F-A-L-A-I-S-E, called the Falaise Gap. And that was, the fighting was just so severe there. The losses on both sides were horrendous. And that's where I saw my first dead German, hanging out the window of a house as I was driving by. But that's also where we saw the deadly effects of these rocket-firing typhoons, because they'd attacked the German convoy and pretty well wiped out the convoy, apparently, because you could see the burned-out spots on the road. Some of the vehicles were in the ditch, but some of them had been towed away. So that was the busiest that I was. I went 3 weeks without answering roll call or undressing. I did manage to change my socks a couple of times, which the other guys appreciated. But I would be sent out for dispatch, come in, report in, go to bed, whether it was middle of the day or middle of the night. And that went on for about 3 weeks. And we were pretty exhausted by that time. But the infantry guys were, you know, they were just decimated in the battles again and again. But the Germans were decimated more. And then we moved on up, this was up into Belgium. And we were just across the border, still in France, a place called Poppering. And I went out on a dispatch one day up into Belgium, and the stores were open. So I had an ice cream cone, but it was mainly frozen water with a little flavoring in it, but it tasted good. Then I found a fruit and vegetable store, and I thought, gee, I'll take some apples back for the guys. So I stuffed my tunic with apples, and I stuffed my saddlebags with apples. This was on my way back after the dispatch, and I get back to the camp and open my saddlebags. I had applesauce instead of apples bouncing over the cobblestone roads. The ones I had in my tunic were all right, so they did get a few treats, but and that was where two guys, I didn't know them, they were with one of the other outfits, were driving, and the truck went out of control, and they went right into a big maple tree. And the driver was thrown out, but the co-driver, his just thrown forward, and his head hit the frame around the windshield. And we heard the crash, and as I jumped on the bike, and the others ran, got out there, and the driver was lying on the ground, but I could see the other guy in the truck, but the thing had burst into flame. You couldn't get near it. That was a gruesome sight. And the tires on the truck started to explode, and they were like a cannon going off, boom, in the flames. Anyway, there's lots of experiences. One day, still in northern France, we had moved to a farm location, and there was a valley down the middle of the farm, and one of our units, my unit, stayed on top of the valley to dig in, and one was in the valley, and the other, there were 3 parts to our outfit up on the hill the other side. And we tried to dig slit trenches. It had been hot and dry, and this was clay land. You needed a jackhammer to get it, so we gave up, and we did have camouflage nets to put over our vehicles. And that's where I began to believe in camouflage nets, because they were terrible things to put on. They caught on everything in the truck. You know, they were mesh, and but we put them on, and we heard planes coming, and 3 German fighter bomber planes came. One came right straight down the valley, one on that side and one on this side. That road was out this side, and the only one that fired was the one over the road. There was a 60 hundredweight truck loaded with infantry guys coming out to the mob laundry for a bath, and he opened fire on the truck. And there was an English dispatch rider following the truck. And again, I was on the bike out there fast as I could get, and again, I think there were 3 men killed. I don't know how many wounded. And the dispatch rider was in the ditch just shaking like a leaf, and something, whether it was a bullet or shrapnel, it burned his top lip and his nose. That's how close curtains were for him. So we took him in and some of the others into the camp and got him a cup of coffee, and he got settled down and took off again. So there were those kind of experiences, and you were thinking, well, that could have been me. To be a DR, we were always alone on the road, and you'd have an open road and sit back and open it up, and oh, this is great. And you'd be looking around the country and realize that I could be seen from anywhere and could pick up a bullet, but I was lucky. You just had to put that kind of thinking out of your head. We knew that every day could be our last day. That was a given. But if you let that dwell on you, you were done. So we just barreled merrily along and did what we could. We were up to Holland by that time, and we were beginning to discover how bad it had been for the people of Holland. They were very badly mistreated, and they were at the point of burning furniture to heat their homes. This was the coldest winter they'd had for years, and we're told at one point the temperature was minus 15 Fahrenheit, a little colder than 15 Celsius. But the Canadians and British, I think it was, that had captured Antwerp, and that was a great port. Up until this time, we had to bring our supplies from Bayeux in Calais all the way up, and we just couldn't keep up to it. But when they captured Antwerp, and this was back and forth battle, we had it and then we didn't, and we had it and we didn't. One day there was a tunnel under the river at Antwerp, and it was great. I pulled it, the first time I pulled in there, and it's all lit and tiled and everything, and boy, it was great for the reverberation of the bike, you know, vroom, vroom. And so I was through there a couple of times, and then I'm scheduled to go through again, and I get there, and there's a couple of either Dutch or Belgian underground soldiers there in their uniform stopped me, and they said, can't go, Germans at the other end. Well, thank you. So I had to then go down the river till I could find a bridge that wasn't blown and go across and come up to the unit that I was delivering a dispatch to. So I've always been very grateful to those two underground soldiers for their stopping me. But then it was important then that the river be cleared to Antwerp. But at the mouth of the river was a very strong German stronghold. They realized the importance of keeping that shut. So the 2nd Canadian Corps, was assigned the job of wiping the Germans out of that area. And began to rain. I've never seen as much mud in my life. I've ridden the bike down roads where the mud, just plain mud, was about a foot deep. I had to keep the motor revved, or the back pressure would have stalled it, and then I would have been in real bad shape. But there's islands there at the mouth of the river, South Beveland and North Beveland and Walcheren. I've been on all of those. But you had to go across the pontoon bridge to get to some of them. And if you've never crossed a pontoon bridge on a motorcycle between two 60 hundredweight trucks, you haven't had too much excitement. It was really tricky, and but we got across, and again the battle was fierce. But by this time, the Germans were afraid of the Canadians, especially, I think, and we got that cleared, and that opened the port of our supplies. Instead of going back to Bayeux, we could go back to Antwerp. And some of 2nd Corps went up to The Hague, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and my section of it went east across the southern part of Holland. And that's where I had my 21st birthday somewhere. And we went up through Sertogenbosch, Grave, Nijmegen, and Almelo. And we were in a little town called Oss, O-S-S, for much of the winter in a Roman Catholic school, which was much better than in the tent shacks that we built. And that was the only place where we were badly received. Kids wouldn't take candy from us. And it turned out, we learned that the priest of that school had, for some reason, been telling people that the Canadians were far worse than the Germans were. And that meant we were pretty awful people. No wonder the kids didn't want to take candy from us. But I don't think we were there 2 weeks before we owned the town. The burgomaster was throwing a dance on Saturday night, and all this. It was a cold place, all right. There again, the German planes flew over one day, I think it was New Year's Day, and didn't fire, drop a bomb or anything. And there we were with over 100 vehicles, and he could have wiped out a good chunk of the supply resources of the Canadian Army, or 2nd Corps. But they were heading for an airport that we had, but they were right at treetop level. And we just trembled. And that school was under one of the paths of you've heard of the buzz bombs, and they were scary things. They had a motor on them, and those motors didn't work very well. And having had some mechanical experience, I would lie there at night and hear these things, and if the motor stopped, which it often did, then the bomb might glide, or it might just dive. And but when they went over the school, it rattled every window and shook the building. There were powerful motors in them, and one did land out in a field outside the little town, and our field park, our base was way out there, and they had one of these old oil heaters in the orderly room. That's where the office, and it had a bat wing, like a spring door, and when this bomb landed, it blew that stove out, like blew the flame out, and they were hard to blow out, but it blew that door open. And but the next morning, a lot of the roofs or the houses were tile, and you see the people out picking up their tile. And I would be riding on the bike, and of course we had a helmet with ear covers on, and you wouldn't hear them, but you'd see the civvies running. I got to realize that was time to duck. I would pull over and lie down in the ditch, and then open my helmet, and I could hear until it went over, and then I get back on my journey again. But we moved on up from Oss to Grove, and we were there for quite a while, and I guess we were there when the paratroop debacle happened, gliders and paratroops south of Nijmegen, Xanten, and Cleve, where we were again. They were wiped out, and but then we moved up to Nijmegen itself, and I remember one day going out north to Arnhem, northeast I guess it is, but there were dead cows in 2 fields, one each side of the road, that had been caught in a crossfire, and I counted 28 dead cows on one side of the road and 30 on the other, and people were starving. But of course they couldn't get to them in time to use them, they just rotted away. When we were in Nijmegen, we were stationed in a former mental institution. And I didn't mention, when we were in Grove, we were in a mental institution. When we were in Etching Hill in England, we were in a mental institution. So there's a reason for the name Crazy Canucks. Anyway, when we were in Nijmegen, they took the whole front yard to make a cemetery out of it for the Canadian soldiers. And they bring them and bury them there, just in their blankets, you know. And we went on up to Almelo, and we were camping on a beautiful soccer field, and I was a soccer player, and we drove those 10-ton Mack diesel trucks across that beautiful, beautiful field, and we built makeshift shacks. We would build a wooden end, 2 ends, and stretch a tarp over top of them. And this was still in the cold winter. And some of the guys started to experiment with heating stoves. And they developed one. We had diesel oil for and they discovered if they put a heavy steel plate in one of the jerry cans or water cans that we had, cut the hole in the top and put the plate in, and then they fitted a drip from a can of diesel, and as long as the plate was hot, the gas or the diesel would catch fire, and so that was fine. But if in the cold night, the diesel oil would get thicker and it wouldn't run, and the fire would go out and it'd be cold. So they mixed a little bit of gas with the diesel, and finally they were just dripping pure gas into this thing, which scared the daylights out of me. But our guys, there are probably 8 of us, I think, in this little tent. You were snuggled up pretty good. But we scrounged a generator, and we had lights. And one of the guys had a radio, but that didn't matter. But it rained one night, and the generator stopped. It was outside the shack, you know. And we went out, and we finally got it going. But we discovered there was a joint in the wires, and it was outside the shack, but there was enough wire we could pull it inside. But it had shorted, and we didn't want to shut the generator off to repair it. And I had worked on cars, and I'd done some wiring. So I'm elected to try to take these wires apart carefully and not connect my fingers with the black and white ones. And I got them apart all right. And I got the black and the 2 blacks together and we're just taping them. And my little finger hit the white wire. Boy, did I ever get a bang. But I went back at it and we had lights. Anyway, we had a call to go back to Bayou for a load of the cylinders for the flamethrowers, as we handled them for the flamethrowers for the infantry, which, by the way, were terribly terrifying for the Germans and for the people of Holland as well, because they would burn a barn in no time at all, or set it on fire, you know. And the burgomaster in Almelo had called a dance for Saturday night, and one of the truck drivers had met a girl in Almelo, and he wanted to go to the dance with her. So he persuaded me to take the 10-ton Mack diesel truck back to Bayou to pick up a load of these cylinders, and he got it worked through the OC, and so I was dressed up. I didn't have my DR outfit on. That was one thing with the dispatch rider outfit. My regular outfit was always pretty neat because it wasn't used. The pants were under my mattress where they were pressed every day. And I'm walking down to get the truck, and all of a sudden, kaboom, there's a fire. And one of the guys, we called them jerry cans for gas, green ones for gas, brown ones for water. And he had started a fire and decided to heat up some water. We put the wrong can on, and it exploded. And of course it caught, and our shacks were just in a row. And I was right there. I called one of the other guys, because the sparks had hit one of the shacks. I said, grab the other side of the tarpaulin and pull it out into the field. And which we did, and it meant that gap stopped the fire from going from one end to the other. Then we take off down, there were, I think, 4 of us, 4 trucks, and out on the open, they had a big steering wheel and a bench seat, and get out on the open road and just roll along. But when you came to a little town, I found it was a lot more difficult than riding a bike through the towns. So I was exhausted when we got to Bayou, but they loaded us up, and they warned us that these cylinders are very difficult to transport because they really needed much more reinforcement on their racks than they had. You had to be very careful going around sharp turns and that. You had to really slow down. So we managed to make our way back to Almaloo, but that was the only time I accepted the pleasure of driving a 10-ton Mack through the diesels fields. And we had our chaplain visited us there, and we had a church service in the stands one beautiful day, and sang a few hymns, and he had a message for us. That was the first, when we were in Oss, we used to have church services, and Army church services are pretty barren, and some of us who had been church young people used to stay on after the Army church service and to attend the civilian service. We couldn't understand a lot of what was going on, but it was worshipful, and we enjoyed it. So the story comes ending. We moved from Almaloo up to Oldenburg in Germany, and that's where we got word from the German civilians, that the war was over. Eventually we got the official word. But then I expected to go to the Army of Occupation because I was young, I was single, and I'd only been in the Army just over 2 years at that point, and a prime candidate for Army of Occupation. But number 3 section of our unit was ordered back to Grove to start demobbing the Canadian Army. And the lieutenant in charge of the unit wanted me to go with them. So he pleaded with the OC and got big permission for me to go back with them, and, which I did, and we were in Grove and then back up to Nijmegen, and we had a big storehouse there. We were taking the mortars and rifles and Bren guns and Sten guns, that sort of thing. And one of my buddies had been trained as a clerk and storeman. I was a dumb DR. I didn't know anything about clerking and storming. And they sent him, he'd been in 5 years and he was married. They sent him home. And I'm in charge of this depot. And the infantry would bring in a 60 hundredweight load of rifles, which were all supposed to have been cleared of ammunition and oiled, everything. And they would just toss them in as they found them. And I'm in charge of this, so they'd come in a deluge. We'd unload the trucks, and the rifles go here, and the Bren guns here, and that. We didn't have any markings on the floor or anything. And then we had to pack them up in boxes and send them out to be stored and clear them of ammunition, especially. When we would be doing this, I had a British Pioneer Corps. They were laboring soldiers to do the work. But we all pitched in, and a couple of guys would get up in the truck, and the rest of us would go back and forth. You'd hold your arms out, and they'd fill it with rifles. I brought my armful in and dropped down like that, and bang! And the guy behind me had hit the trigger on a rifle, and it blew the plaster off the wall above my head. And So I went in and had words with our regimental sergeant major, who was a good guy, and he calmed me down and said, well, we'll send out new word, but if we refused to unload the truck, they'd say, keep the truck, we'll make our way back. We couldn't win. Then they'd bring over from Canada a captain who'd been in Ottawa in stores all through the war, and he came and visited one day just after we'd unloaded a truck, and he really blew his stack. I want these places, I want stalls printed on the floor, or line printed on the floor with its identification and everything. Oh, I had it. I went into this regimental sergeant major again. He was a Scottish guy, and I'd had several rather heated visits with him, and he handled me beautifully. Anyway, I went in again, and I said, I'll go to the Army of Occupation, I'll go anywhere you say, but I'm not going to be saddled with that blah, blah, blah. I had rich language in those days. And again, he calmed me down, and what's the matter? And I told him, oh, just leave it with me. Well, Captain Fraser never entered that door from that day till I left. Anyway, then it was, I got a furlough back to England, and met my brother who'd been in the Air Force in London, and we met and visited some of my dad's people and stayed with them, and then back to Holland again, and that's when when I got back to Holland, they had turned my bike in. I'd had a bed made, a steel frame with a Jeep cover for the mattress, and very comfortable. Somebody had taken that, and we were moved up to the same building we were in Nijmegen on our way up through. This time, the significant event there was that the truckload of German prisoners came exhuming these bodies and moving them out to the permanent cemetery. And it was pretty rich atmosphere. But I visited the cemetery. Wynne and I visited that in '95, as well as one that up in northern part of Holland. But I think that's enough. Okay, you know, as I say, I was up in Oldenburg, and the peace was signed, and the war was over. So eventually, I come home, and I would go home to my family that I loved and were glad to see me home to the village where I grew up and knew everything and everybody, and but it wasn't the same. And I went into the public school that I had attended. It was just a two-room, one senior room and a beginner's room, and it was so small. And I got thinking, it's not the village that changed, it's me. And then, as time went on, I began to feel there's a lot of adjustments to make. And in one of my sermons at one point, I said, the signing of the documents of peace, the end of hostilities, brings an end to the formal hostilities, but it can't bring an end to the war that's still going on inside. And that, once I realized that, I realized I had an adjustment to to make. And I was fortunate that I had a family, I had a church, I had a community. And I really felt sorry for the guys and gals that came home that didn't have that kind of support, that they had to fish it all out on their own. And I was back at my woodwork shop, which I loved, and that was where I was going to spend the rest of my life. And they had my job waiting for me, and they were great. And but I had, I forget, 2 or 3 months before I would be officially discharged. And a buddy of mine that I'd worked with at the woodwork shop before the war, we were back together again, only he was married, which was another thing. Most of my buddies were married, and I wasn't. Anyway, we met many times, and we got talking, and we both said, I'm fed up with this, nothing to do. Let's go up and get our discharge, and we can begin to pick up life again. So we came up to Toronto ahead of time and got our discharge paper right there. And we had never stayed. The Horse Palace in Toronto was where troops had stayed and where recruits were billeted and started their training. We had never been in the Horse Palace. And we said, the war's over. We're not going to spend a night in the Horse Palace. We had to spend overnight in the process of discharge. So Carl and I rented a room in a small hotel. It was over on Sherbourne Street or over there somewhere. And we didn't know Toronto at all. And double bed. Carl was a little taller than I am, and raw-boned, a great guy. And so he was on the outside of the bed, I was against the wall. Woke up in the middle of the night, and I'm plastered against the wall. Anyway, we got our discharge and back at the woodwork shop, and the world was unfolding like it should. And then I went to church one night. We had a new minister coming, and the minister in charge of the service that night talked about the need for candidates for ministry. And I'd been active in the church, but I hadn't thought of ministry. And that started a very disturbing time for a disturbed young guy. You know, I hadn't really got my life back together again. I fought it for about 6 months and then had to finally give in and go to college. I was out of school when I was 14 years old. I had 2 years high school at that point, and so I'd get my high school and then college and get to college. Veterans Affairs had started these rehab schools for veterans, and I was lucky to get into one in Hamilton. And the rest of that is history. That's not part of the story, but I was ordained in 1952, and I don't know how many years ago that makes it now, 57 or something like that I've been an ordained minister. It was quite an experience, the whole thing. I'm not glad I had it, but it was a real growing experience for a 19-year-old kid. You grow in a hurry, and I think I learned a lot about people, and a lot about what makes the world go around, and this contributed to my work as a minister. So thanks very much for talking with her, letting me talk so much.